about a nonfiction book that I read actually in January, I think now. It's Still Life with Bones, and the subtitle is Genocide, Forensics, and What Remains by Alexa Hagerty. And this might be my new favorite book of all time, partly because the writing was absolutely gorgeous, just incredibly beautifully written, and partly just for partly for the information that I gained, and I think the value that this book had for me as a learner. And just the storytelling. I mean, she weaves a nonfiction narrative of violence and science with incredibly human themes around philosophy and religion and ritual and grief. It was just incredibly well done. This is like a 10-star book on a 5-star scale. I absolutely loved it. Which is a weird thing to say because the subject matter of this book is based on such awful events. So, this book, Alexa Hagerty is an anthropologist, I believe a social anthropologist, and this book is based on some research and learning that she did during her graduate degree, I believe, in Guatemala and Argentina. So she was working with forensic anthropology teams that are working to uncover the remains of people who were killed by state violence in both of those countries. So in Guatemala, she's helping to exhume remains of the approximately 200,000 people that were killed during the armed conflict from 1960 to 1996, a period called La Violencia. And in Argentina, from the period when Argentina was ruled by a military dictatorship, or like 1976 to 1983. I hope I'm getting the dates right. I tried to look them up in the book. And up to 30,000 people were killed by the state during that time in Argentina. The violence in Guatemala is usually categorized as genocide because a lot of the emphasis was on people in Mayan communities, as well as all the usual targets of state violence. Dissenters and people who disagree with what the state is doing. But anyway, just horrific scale of death in both countries. And so she's talking about the process of being with these forensic anthropology teams and trying to recover those remains and the process of trying to figure out who they are so that their remains can be returned to their families. And there were just so many themes that stood out in this book and so many observations. One was the idea of habitus, that even from people's bones, you can see so much about the way that they lived or the conditions in which they lived. In Guatemala, things like what occupation that they had. The bones of somebody who wove for a living were different from the bones of somebody who was a tailor for a living. And she talks about how the wealth of forensic knowledge that's been gained from these efforts has upturned things like science's understanding of the difference between male and female skeletons, because that looks very different if all of your initial data points are from like a European population versus now you have a very different population in terms of lifestyle and occupation. When you're dealing with this very different set of bones. Another thing that stood out was the use of archives, and it's really interesting because in both countries, part of the terror is that people disappear with no record for the families, but often the government, the agencies that are actually doing this violence, they have records because they're targeting specific people or groups of people. So that's just horrifying that in some ways a record even of this secret violence exists. And those archives are really important for trying to track down who different remains belong to. Another thing I thought was really interesting is she talks about going to interacting with some of the families when they return the remains of their loved ones. And she talks about how new rituals have basically been developed around funerary rites to deal with this situation of receiving bones instead of a body. And so she talks about being present for some of those those rituals and noting the differences between what might be like a typical burial practice and what families are now doing for this different scenario. She also talks a lot about the compassion and the respect of the people who are doing this work. One example is there is a body of a girl who was found that they haven't been able to figure out who she is to return her bones. And so her bones are being used as part of the training of the forensic anthropology team. And her case is usually presented as a test to the new trainees because the forensic anthropologists keep the bones of her dog with her. Her dog was murdered at the same time. And they were able, through oral histories of people who had been kept in the same detention center and in communities nearby, it was like, oh yeah, there was a girl who was always around the military base. She disappeared, but before she disappeared, we always saw her with her dog. And so they keep her with her dog. And one of the forensic anthropologists doing the training is like, she was always with her dog. Like, obviously we keep her with her dog. There's also just such a fascinating blend of science and other ways of knowing throughout this, because the use of forensic anthropology to identify these human remains from state violence has really been pioneered in these two cases in Guatemala and Argentina, and these teams have since trained other teams and worked in other regions around the world, which is really awful that there's so much work for them. But it started from a really scientific basis where some of the groups, a Truth Commission in Argentina and a group that was the Grandmothers of Plaza del Mayo, which was a group of mothers of the disappeared who were trying to find out what had happened to their loved ones, and in particular to what might have happened to babies that were born in detention centers. They reached out to the American Association for the Advancement of Science, AAAS, and were like, does the U.S. have forensic tools that can be used to help us here? And this was in like the 90s, the 80s and 90s. And so an American anthropologist, Clyde Snow, went down and worked for decades training people and helping to develop these programs. And even though he came in with a really like Western European-based kind of scientific perspective, and he had to revise all of his assumptions and practices. And then it's really grown up with this idea that you have to really work with communities and listen to other ways of knowing. So one thing in Guatemala is that in Mayan traditions, there's a lot of emphasis on dreams as a way of knowing about the world. And so there are stories in here of local community members who will say, well, I had a dream that my brother is buried under a really big pine tree, and go out in that field and like look under those pine trees. And a couple of times they've like followed the dream and found remains as a result of that. So that was really interesting, and just the response of the team to sort of these more spiritual or emotional ways of people communicating what they know about where these bodies might be. What else? Another thing that was really shocking is the role of the United States in actually just like training some of these military personnel that went on to do these absolutely horrific things, and the legitimacy that the United States gave to these regimes when they were in power, and to the individuals in these regimes, and the impunity that so many people had after these time periods, where some people have been brought to some justice in the aughts and the 2010s, but there's still just so many people out there who haven't faced any repercussions of their participation in this violence. And so some of these forensic anthropology teams, they face death threats, and they face their own violence as they go about doing this work, because there are people who don't want these remains to be uncovered. I also just wanted to share, I guess, just a couple just sort of snippets of the writing and how Alexa Hagerty just weaves in philosophy and comments on the insufficiency of language to convey some of the magnitude of this. In one passage here, she's just sort of reflecting on the human condition and sort of like what it means to have a body. So she says, in the Argentine summer, I look at the hands of men I pass on the street, men who make change for me in shops, men reading newspapers on the subway. I imagine the hands of strangers holding machetes. In Argentina, cattle prods were the weapon of choice for torture. For killing, the military favored guns and pushing prisoners from planes, drugged but alive, into the ocean or the wide brown Rio de la Plata. Genocide is a misleading word. It's violence dressed up in Greek and Latin. It sounds like pesticide, like something sprayed from a bottle at arm's length. But violence is often intimate, taking place body to body. A man ties a ligature or a blindfold with the same dexterous movements that the guy at the corner vegetable stand knots my bag of tomatoes. A trigger is squeezed between thumb and forefinger in the same motion that a coin is picked up from the floor. A fist closes around a machete, a hand grabs a newborn's tender ankle, two palms rest against a young man's back. In Precarious Life, philosopher Judith Butler argues for an ethics founded on our shared human condition as vulnerable bodies. She writes, "The body implies mortality, vulnerability, agency. The skin and the flesh expose us to the gaze of others, but also to touch and to violence. It is also with the body that we gaze at others, caress them, and hurt them. Vulnerability is the basis of care and harm, compassion and torture. Hands are menacing. Violence feels as possible and ordinary as handshaking, backslapping, or lighting a cigarette. It seems possible that the grocer, the man sitting next to me on the bus, or the man holding his daughter's hand as they crossed the street could have severed a prisoner's Achilles or smashed the soft skull of a baby. If they have not, it seems less like innocence than an accident of history." So, ouch. Another piece that she really weaves in throughout the book a lot, I kind of mentioned it earlier on when I was mentioning habitus and what you can tell from people's livelihoods and occupations from their bones, but she talks just so much about the value of what bones, the bones provide and the stories that they tell, and that it really can be kind of the voices of people coming back. One section in which I thought just really eloquent about that was she was talking about the death flights in Argentina, which were just mentioned in that previous passage, which was one of the ways of killing people. They were usually drugged or sedated and then taken up in airplanes and pushed out over the ocean or over the Rio de la Plata, the large river there. And so she talks at looking at those bones and just the fact that they were just completely shattered, like spider web of cracks. And that language, like just describing that, right? That it doesn't kind of hit home, and that you need the story as it's told physically through the bones. So here's just her section of wrapping up a day of doing that work. She says, "It is getting late. We return the shattered bones to their labeled bags and tuck them into the box to be stored among the rest. No name is written on the cardboard, only a code, but Amelia says he has been matched through the DNA database. As soon as the judge signs off, which is just a formality, the family will bury him." "Que lástima," says Amelia. "What a pity." Then she makes a correction. "This is a good thing. This is what everyone works so hard to accomplish, that the bodies be returned to families." We gather our coats and climb down the stairs. Everyone else has left. On the busy corner, we say goodbye. Walking home alone, I press through the crowds of Once. It is strange to be back in the world of the living after spending the day in the lab. I'm still thinking about the man's body on the exam table, about the slip of the tongue, que lástima. I know how dedicated Amelia and Adriana are to their work and to the mission to restore the missing to their families. Yet the que lástima was honest too. Any body can be buried. Cemeteries are full of bones. It is a shame to lose these articulate bones and their vivid testimony. Once his body is buried, his bones will be gone. They will no longer tell their forensic story. All stories require a listener, and this one can only be transmitted body to body by holding a cranium to better see or running fingers across a fracture to feel. Hand to bone, we the living, understand in a way that words cannot capture what the term death flight means. Later, this man's story will be told with words like, "They threw him from an airplane." His shattered bones will become biography, and their fractures will disappear into language. It is a necessary translation. It is also inadequate. More will be gained, there's no question. So many delicate things had to align to reach the point of his burial. Searching, finding, cleaning, articulating, sampling. Or, from another perspective, the madres had to gather in Plaza del Mayo on Thursday afternoons. Clyde Snow had to show up in Argentina in his fedora. A group of anthropology students had to be brave or reckless enough to start digging for the disappeared. You could also say that genetic technologies had to be pioneered, DNA databases established, protracted legal battles against impunity fought. And don't forget about the other labors, the work of grief, the years of waiting. For this man to be found, named, and buried has required an epic journey. It seems like a miracle when you think about it. And then just a little bit later on, the man in the lab's story is changing form too. After years of being lost, he has been found. He has regained his name. Soon he will be buried with tears and ceremony by those who love and mourn him. He will return to those who have waited, as it should be. But on the quiet street, in the fading light, there is a passing moment of forensic melancholy for the bones that will no longer speak. And then towards the end of the book, and I'll just end my video with this too, she has just a moment of wondering and just a moment of hopefulness as she ends the heartbreaking account of this book. She says, "What is to be learned from the catastrophe of history? Can inheritances of violence be transformed? Where are the well springs of courage found? How do we go on in the face of incalculable loss? These are the questions the dead ask us. They cannot be answered or ignored. We can only live into the questions. For this, we have science and law. For this, we have ritual, dreams, and each other." W.H. Auden wrote, "Through art, we are able to break bread with the dead, and without communion with the dead, a fully human life is impossible. The living need what the ancestors ask us and ask of us. There aren't answers, but there are lessons. In the Pozo and in the lab, the dead whisper to me that it didn't have to be this way. The massacres, secret prisons, and hidden graves, all the terror and loss. Another world is possible. On a burning planet pockmarked by mass graves, it is hard to have much faith. But my work among the dead has taught me that even in the face of violence and terror and breakdown, even at the bottom of the well, there is something, a movement of life, an impulse for justice, a kind of pulsating love. It can be blocked and slowed, and often is, but it will never be eradicated or killed because it flows through everything, ecstatic, electric, unstoppable. It moves in us, through us, and between us, as we surface between ancestor and progeny, between those who came before and those who will come after, as we float together in this vanishing moment, in the fragile possibility of remaking the world." She mentions there a little bit the bottom of the well and the name, the Pozo. So a lot of the mass graves that have been found in Guatemala and in Argentina are in wells because that was an easy place to dispose of bodies. And the Pozo is the name of a really, really big one in Argentina that she spent some time helping to excavate in this book. So if you want to read a book that is absolutely gorgeous, but if you're like me, you might have to put down every 2 to 3 pages because you are crying, then this is the book. But I think this is one of the most important reads I will probably read in my life, just for exposing the inhumanity of mass violence that shows up in the headlines and sometimes only decades after the fact, and is ongoing. And she mentions a lot of the other places where this has happened and is happening. And of course, here in the US, we are engaging in disappearing people right now. So really important read, really gorgeous read. If you've read this, please let me know what you think in the comments down below. And if you haven't read it, I hope you consider picking it up. So thanks for bearing with me in a really long video for me, and I will see you all in the next one. Bye.